right before I talk about the young women and the uprising of the 20,000, or some people call it the uprising of the 30,000, I want to say a word about the conditions at the Triangle factory itself. Sarah laid out a picture of horrific exploitation, incredibly long hours, horrible wages, and a kind of discipline that Joe referred to too. That meant that the women were just working like nonstop, hour after hour after hour, day after day after day, to try to make just a little bit of money to contribute to the family exchequer. Those were the conditions at the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory, and those were good conditions in the garment industry of New York in 1911. The Triangle Shirtwaist Factory, there are about 500 enterprises that made shirtwaists alone in New York in the 1910s. 500 enterprises making shirtwaists. So the competition was absolutely incredible. And so the Triangle factory was a modern factory. It was on 3 floors of a 10-story building in Washington Square. There were hundreds of workers there in the three top floors of that building. They had some natural light. They were not in a dark, dank basement someplace. For the garment industry, the workers made actually decent wages, $5 a week maybe for 12-hour days, 6 days a week, and 7 days a week then when we're in the season. The conditions were actually as good as they got in 1911 at the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory. And even in that best of all possible shirtwaist factories, we could have a fire, that killed 146 workers. So that's on the good end. And I think the point is that it wasn't. We don't want to vilify the particular factory owners of the Triangle because it's the competition. If we are going to abdicate our decisions about working conditions to the market, this is what we get. This is as good as it gets. This is the best it could be. That's what we get. And so one of the meanings of the fire, as of course we were all going to say over and over and over again, was that it brought home the responsibility, what we get when we leave things to the market, and the responsibility of the political community, of us as a national community, to say, maybe that's something we don't want to leave to the market alone. Maybe not. Those women, it's very tempting when we think about those horrific working conditions that the girls themselves or the women themselves often said made them feel like they were treated like they were a part of the machine, that the contractors who oversaw their work at the Triangle, for instance, the owners of factories in general, worked them as though they were simply a part of a machine, not a human being at all. I mean, of course, it was in their interest to do that, the contractors and the owners. So it's very tempting to see those girls as nothing but pathetic, exploited children, actually. And to some degree, they were that. And that they were young, that they were immigrants, that they were women. All those characteristics employers depended on, they counted on to subordinate the women. They counted on the deference that should come from the young for the old, from women to men. And in the case of immigration, one of the things that employers counted on was that they could divide workers, they could keep workers from uniting as a class by playing on and exploiting ethnic differences, ethnic suspicions, and even just the language barriers among the workers. So the employers counted on those characteristics to maintain their own power over those workers. And of course, women workers in particular did have disabilities that were peculiar to them. Gender did offer particular disabilities. Often those girls and women who worked at the Triangle and throughout the garment industry had a double day. At the end of the day, they couldn't go to a union meeting. They were often expected to go home and help with the housework. Right? They're going to go help put the dinner on and and clean up after dinner. In the case of Italian women, the majority of garment workers in New York City at this point, the majority of them actually were Eastern European Jewish immigrant women and girls. The sort of next biggest group were Italian women and girls. And in Italian families, very often, although fathers would allow their daughters to go to work unchaperoned, they weren't allowed to go anyplace else unchaperoned. And so that meant that if a girl were going to stay after work to go to a union meeting or go back out after dinner to a union meeting, somebody else had to go too. So you had to have two people available, not just one, in order to make union participation possible for an Italian girl, an unmarried girl especially. And then another peculiar disability of women workers was that the male leadership of the union movement didn't have much interest in them at best. They're doing pretty well when the guys were indifferent to them. There's actually overt hostility among men in the labor movement at that point toward women in the labor force. They thought that the best possible outcome of the labor movement itself would be to get women out of the labor market, because that's not where they should be. Men should be able to make enough money to support an entire family, and that was a part of what it meant to be a man, for pity's sake, right? So to organize women workers was to capitulate to a gender arrangement they did not believe in, they did not want, and that insulted their own notion of who they ought to be. Really very profound reason for the resistance there. So there's a lot of hostility among working class men and union men to women in the labor market, and so women workers had a hard time getting any cooperation from them to organize them against these conditions. So there really were special disabilities that women workers suffered in the labor market. Nevertheless, as Sarah said, in 1909, 1910, these young immigrant women and girls, in 1909, they had reached a point where they were fed up enough with their conditions, but also hopeful enough that they could change them. Two crucial components of any social movement. They were fed up, but they were also hopeful. These women and girls mounted just an absolutely shocking strike. It was a general strike that they led in the garment industry. Literally tens of thousands of girls and women walked off their jobs from these hundreds of garment operations, garment producing operations across the city, and demanded that their wages be increased, that their hours be shortened, and safety be improved. And of course, that they get union recognition. In fact, the number one desire, the number one demand was union recognition, because they wanted some kind of power over those conditions of labor. And so union recognition was number one. But for many of them, in fact, safety issues were more important than wages or hours, because they saw, in the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory, for instance, there were constantly little fires erupting, because it was a fire trap, a fireproof building. It was lauded as this building, the Ash building, as a fireproof building. But there were, piles of fabric everywhere and patterns, because the cutters were usually men, and they made a lot more money than the sewers. At this point, at the Triangle anyway, there were knives that allowed the guys to put down a pattern on 100, sometimes as many as 100 sheets of cloth. I'm sure that's not the right language. I'm sure that's not technical language. Sheets of cloth. I'm sure that's not it. It's like bolts of fabric. There's got to be some other language there. And they could cut through all those at once, and then those the fabric would be thrown out to different girls at different machines. So there are these piles of fabric everywhere. There are threads everywhere. There are the paper that made the patterns. That's everywhere. And as people smoked, especially, those things are constantly being set on fire. And so there are pails around where girls would throw water on those piles of fabric.
Didn't they have gas lamps in those days?
Yes, and gas. Thank you. Yes, gas lamps. It was just a terrible risk. And of course, the workers knew that. right? They're the ones who know this. So at the top of the list then, after union recognition, were safety measures that the girls wanted. And women. There's just so many of them were so young, and they're mostly teenagers. It's just amazing, actually, what they were able to do. So they mount this, this strike in the fall of 1909, and these thousands of women come out, and this just stuns New York City. Right, it stuns the guys in the labor movement. They think, what? We thought like girls wouldn't come out and do this. Like, they thought they weren't brave enough for a picket line. Thought they couldn't negotiate. And the girls create these picket lines. They get beaten black and blue, even though they have every right to picket peacefully, and even to try to persuade strikebreakers not to break a picket line. They actually have a legal right to that. They're arrested, they're beaten up, they're jailed. Some of them are sent to hard labor for a few days at a time. And they try to say, I think I have a right to do this. I have a right to do this, Mr. Kopp, as he's taking them off to jail. In the end, it's sort of a mixed result. Here. In something like 300 of those 500 operations, the owners settled. Almost in all of those cases, the women and girls got union recognition and they got higher wages. The guys who were negotiating for them, so these would be men in the International Ladies Garment Workers Union, decided the safety issues weren't as important, and were willing to put those to the side, so that they got union recognition, they got wage increases at most of these places, but safety was sold out almost down the line. At the Triangle, the workers got wage increases and shorter hours, but they didn't even get union recognition right there. They didn't. So it was a very mixed bag. The point, I think, of this, so that then the fire comes just about a year after the settlement of the strike. There are sort of 2 points I want to take from that. One is that given that the fire could occur after actually a very successful organizing initiative by the workers in that factory and across the city. The fire could happen even after that, suggested how crucial public intervention in private enterprise was if we want to prevent horrific tragedies like the Triangle Fire. That even a very well organized, a very determined, a very unified group of workers, as Joe says, even in that, could not exercise enough power under the conditions of the early 20th century to ensure just basic safety, right? So the public intervention here, it was clearly crucial. The second point I would take from this, I think that is so important, is that the women workers themselves had roused the public in New York to be paying attention to issues in the garment industry and in mass production industry in general. As Joe says, I mean, it's not like this is the first, catastrophe or major accident at work. My heavens, they're happening all the time. I think there are worse ones, in fact, in coal mining and on the railroads. I mean, huge, terrible disasters, just routinely. This one gets a lot more attention than most, and it becomes more productive of public intervention. Why was that? Why does this fire get, or this disaster get the kind of attention it does when so many others didn't? And I think part of the answer to that question is that the workers themselves had roused this public, had roused New Yorkers to be paying attention and to be worried and to be thinking about the labor relation and what was the responsibility of a larger public, of a consuming public, in that labor relation. So the question had been raised, the focus had been created, and the fire then erupts in that context. And in that context, it could have the ultimate meanings that it did, which I think Kirsten will be talking to us more about.
Thank you so much for that.